Madlik listeners, you are in for a treat today. We are recreating the recording that we held this Shabbat for your benefit. So sit back, enjoy the show, and if you have a chance, go to the JCC in Manhattan on Shabbat and check out the Shtiebel. It was electrifying. Welcome to Madlik, recorded live at the Shtiebel at the JCC of Manhattan. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on your favorite podcast platform and now on YouTube and Substack. We also publish a source sheet on Sfaria, and a link is included in the show notes. The Parsha is Kitetse. In our previous episode, we highlighted 3 mitzvot in the Parsha which articulate a message through their actual observance. In this bonus episode of Madlik, we showcase the fact that the mitzvot are actually a cultural language that we need to listen to as much as observe. So, join us for Halakha as a language. Rabbi, we had a real ball this Shabbat. There were over 100 people there. You just had moved the shul, and this is going to be your new home. Is that correct?
Is so exciting. It was such a good way to launch and to inaugurate the Shtiebel at JCC. And it's fun to do it again because you know, Geoffrey, that it said that the Talmud says that when you study something 101 times, it should be like you studied it 100 times. It means every time you have to have a new angle. So this is our chance. This is the second time, and therefore we're going to find something new and interesting here.
Perfect. So we are in Deuteronomy 21, and it has the iconic law of the Ben Sorer Umorer, the rebellious son. It says, if a householder has a wayward and defiant son who does not heed his father or mother and does not obey them, even after they discipline him, and it goes on through a few rituals that have to be held, ultimately what happens if he is identified as a rebellious son, in verse 21 it says, thereupon his town's council shall stone him to death. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. All Israel will hear and be afraid. I mean, Rabbi, there are many laws in the Torah that are a little hard to process, to digest. I think any law for a modern that ends with the death penalty is by nature is going to be tough. But here, certainly, we have the question of a rebellious son. Just reading it, it is an iconic law.
Yeah, I mean, the rabbis, they've been struggling to understand this for at least 2,000 years. How can it be that you can put a child to death, even a troublemaking child? How can you possibly put him to death? So now we'll see what the Talmud has to say about this.
So rather than mince words, the Talmud cuts right to the chase. And in Sanhedrin 71a, it says, there has never been a stubborn and rebellious son, and there will never be one in the future. Ben Sorer Umorer lo haya velo atid liot. And then it asks, therefore, you can ask, why do we have the text in the Torah? And it says, Lama nichtav drosh v'kabel schar. Why was it written? The translation here says, so that you may expound upon new understandings of the Torah and receive reward for your learning, this being an aspect of the Torah that has only theoretical value. Putting it shortly, Rabbi, it's a legal fiction. That's what it is. And it is the iconic legal fiction. I think if you ask people about the Ben Sorer Umorer, we are going to see other instances in the Talmud where they use a similar strategy, but this is the most famous one.
Yeah, now simply, and I know this is what we're going to analyze, but simply drosh v'kabel schar means just study it. It's part of the Torah. You know, as we're going to talk about, there are many laws in the Torah that can't be observed. Nevertheless, we study them. drosh, study them, v'kabel schar. But this is no different than the laws of the temple, which we can't relate to, which have no relevance to us. This also is not relevant and never happened.
So I totally agree. I think that in some of the other instances that we are going to see, it's going to be even more difficult to make this case. But here, at least it says, when it says stone him, it says, V'chol Yisrael yishma'u v'yira'u, and all of Israel will hear and be afraid. So it is almost baking into it, Rabbi, that it has a pedagogic value to it, that it is a learning moment, so to speak. So you can kind of see how the rabbis were able to make this maneuver. Because if it wasn't the actual corporal punishment of the victim that was to be a learning moment, at least hearing and seeing the law itself would have pedagogic value. So I think they did have kind of a leg to stand on.
I mean, I think that that's really good. Generally speaking, anytime that you have a death penalty, the Chol Yisrael Yishma'u v'yira'u, that there's a piece of it that is to teach people or to, encourage people not to do what will get them the death penalty. But it's absolutely for sure that's right.
I mean, I think even in modern scholarship, when they talk about the death penalty, they question, is it punitive or will this stop people from committing the crime? So
Right.
that is a deep-seated argument. But I think for instance, the stone chumash, which they use in your synagogue, it literally relates it to pedagogy, because after all, it is talking about a rebellious child living at home. So this is exactly the kind of thing. It's kind of like some of those fairy tales that we read that we cringe at. They're so scary. But there was a time where they believed in terms of a pedagogic tool, scare the bejesus out of somebody and he won't sin.
And we know it works.
I guess spare the rod and just scare them. But anyway, I did mention that there were other examples of this same strategy. In Sanhedrin 71, just a few pages from where we have the rebellious son, it talks about an Ir Hanidachat. That is an idolatrous city. And it says, there has never been an idolatrous city and there never will be in the future. It's virtually impossible to fulfill all the requirements that must be met in order to apply this halakhah. This is the translator speaking. And why then was the passage relating to idolatrous city written in the Torah? So that you may expound upon new understandings of the Torah and receive reward for your learning. So here too, correct me if I'm wrong, Rabbi, we're talking about a city almost like a Sodom, that it is so evil that it should be destroyed. And again, the rabbis are saying never will happen. But here, of course, the Pesukim do not say, and therefore this is a teaching moment. So I think they really are taking this concept of drosh for kabel schar, of some of the legislation, some of the mitzvot in the Torah are there not so much to observe, but to learn from.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. So the fact that it's not just one, but there are several of these laws makes us see that that was like a strategy in the Torah, right? That there are certain laws in the Torah which are only drosh v'kabel schar. Now, that's kind of surprising in a legal book that they have laws that are not applicable, but that seems to be a strategy in the Torah.
And of course, three's a charm. In a few paragraphs later in Sanhedrin, it brings another example. We're all familiar in Leviticus about the law of a house that has leprosy. And it says that there has never been a house afflicted with leprosy, and there never will be. Drosh v'kabel schar. So whether these are unique instances or whether they can give us, Rabbi, an insight into other commandments too, that whether they're practiced or not have an element of drosh v'kabel schar. That's actually the subject of our talk today. But before we go there, let's talk a second about that word schar. You don't get a reward for it, or your reward is that you study it. There's a famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Father, that says, Schar mitzvah, mitzvah, v'schar avera, avera. And there I think we translate it as the reward for a good deed, a mitzvah, is a mitzvah. So if you go to the trouble to keep Shabbat, what is your ultimate reward? You have the beauty, the oneg of Shabbat. And the schar mitzvah, the reward, now here it's more like a payment for doing a sin, is you're a sinner. You're going to have to live with yourself. You don't feel actually very good after doing a sin. So I think even in this iconic piece of Mishnah, you get a sense that it doesn't necessarily mean reward, because schar avera, it doesn't read that well.
It's causative. If you do one mitzvah, you'll do another mitzvah. If you commit one avera, that'll lead you to commit other averas. Okay. We can argue about the psychology of that.
Yeah, and I think it also means kind of the outcome, as you said, the benefit, the takeaway. I mean, a shomer sachar is someone who watches, is a caretaker, but gets paid for it. So it's really a payment, more of a reward. And I will argue that what the rabbis are really saying when it comes to these three commandments, but maybe to many, many more, is that there is a benefit just in studying the law, above and beyond observing the law, so that there are commandments that there is no observance, and there's still validation for having them on the books. And that's my point. And I think to make it even stronger, there is a beautiful, it sounds like a verse from Tehillim, Rabbi, but I could not find it in Tehillim.
It is not. It's from the davening.
It's a piece of our liturgy that we say after reading the Shema every morning. It says, Ashrei ish sheyishma lemitzvotecha. Happy is the person who, the translation is, observes your commandments, but I'm taking it literally. I'm saying happy is the person who has the ability to hear the commandments, because ultimately, Rabbi, I believe the commandments are a language in and of themselves, and that's the limb I'm going to stand on today.
Good. I mean, and ashrei is a good word. Praise be the person. That's famous. Ashrei yoshrei veitecha. That's one of those words that we use in the davening to express the ultimate praise of that person.
Yep. And it almost makes, they want it to sound biblical. They want it to sound like this was Tehillim, whether it was an innovation or not. So now I want to just expand the horizon of commandments that were written and were never fulfilled. One commandment I didn't put in the source sheet, a mamzer, a bastard, who cannot marry into the people of Israel. The rabbis in the Talmud said, Ein mamzerim beYisrael. There are and never will be a mamzer in Israel, meaning to say, Rabbi, that it's so complicated to comply with all the requirements of being a mamzer. The rabbis made sure it would never happen. I think there are certain rabbis around who should hear that, because they certainly hold things like that as a cudgel against people, but no, that's not the case. Another famous one is corporal punishment. In the Mishnah in Makot, it says, a Sanhedrin that executes someone once in 7 years is characterized as a destructive tribunal. It actually says chavlanit. It's a murder. It's a terrible thing. And Rabbi Eliezer says this applies to a Sanhedrin that executes once in 70 years. And I think that's the famous takeaway. But I looked at the source, and it even goes further. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva said, if we had been members of the Sanhedrin, we would have conducted trials in a manner whereby no person would have ever been executed. So, Rabbi, all the times in the Torah that we read, mot yamut, you shall die, you shall certainly die, what, according to Tarfon and Akiva,
it never happened.
Never happened. So this universe of laws that are simply legal fictions is growing by the minute. I want to finish by something that I discovered in my research that I absolutely fell in love with. And this is that Maimonides, as you know, wrote a book and started actually a whole tradition based on the concept that there are 613 commandments, Tariag Mitzvot, of which 365 are negative commandments, and the balance are positive commandments. He went ahead and he elucidated, categorized every commandment, and at the end of his book, he says, and when you now examine all these commandments that were previously mentioned, you will find among them commandments that are an obligation on the community, not in each and every individual, like the building of the temple or the establishment of the king, the cutting off of the seed of Amalek. And he's starting to list things that don't apply to you and me, Rabbi, just simple Jews who are looking at the commandments and thinking that there are 200 odd positive commandments. He goes on, there are also among them commandments that are obligatory on an individual if he did a certain act or something happens to him, such as a sacrifice or an inadvertent violation sin, such as the law of a Hebrew slave and a Hebrew manservant, the law of a Canaanite slave, an unpaid guardian, the laws of borrowers. And he says, it is possible that an individual will live all of his life and not deal with all of these situations, and so not be obligated in this commandment. And also among them are commandments that are only practiced when the temple is in existence, such as the festival offering. And among them, there are also those that are only practiced by somebody with property, such as tithes, priests, and things like that. And sometimes one will not have these possessions, so he will not be obligated in these commandments. A man may live his whole life, and he will not become obligated by any of the commandments of this type. But there are some that are obligatory on everybody, and he lists those. And he says, and the commandments that are of this type are called definite commandments, because they are definitely obligated for every Jewish man, interesting, that reaches that age at any time, in any place, and whatever the circumstances. So he says, when you examine the 248 positive commandments, you will find that the definite commandments are 60. Rabbi, he went from 248 to 60, and that this is with the stipulation that his situation is the situation of most people. That is, he lives in a house, in a city, eats the foods associated with the human species, meaning to say bread and meat, engages in commerce with people, marries a woman and fathers children. There are 46 commandments that women are also obliged, and 14 that women are not obliged. So now, and I didn't say this when we were live, but if you're a woman and you start to look at mitzvot shahazman grama, you can come down to only 48 commandments that are positive. And it's absolutely amazing, because I think what he's saying is not to say that all the other commandments are irrelevant, Rabbi. What I am arguing today is they remain relevant, but they become something else than touch points of that we have to observe. They are things we need to listen to. Ashrei ish yishma lemitzvotav.
Right. I mean, we're really dividing the laws of the Torah from those laws that are only observed, and you listen and you observe, and those laws that you only listen to, but there was never an intention that you should observe them.
And therefore, it comes of interest, especially if you learn in a yeshiva like you and I did, or you go to shul every Shabbat and you listen to these laws. What do they mean for me? What am I to take away from the halachot? So I had recently listened to a podcast by Shai Held on Hadar, and they actually was talking about Rabbi Soloveitchik. So I picked up this book. It's called Halakhic Man. And Soloveitchik Soloveitchik in this book and in another makes a radical point. I think it's radical to most of us. And he says that there is only a single source from which a Jewish philosophical Weltanschauung could emerge: the objective order, the halakhah. What he argues, Rabbi, is if you want to understand what the essence of Judaism is, don't go look at beautiful midrashim. Don't go look at wonderful flowing commentaries and theology, biblical narratives and story. He is arguing, and it's radical, you have to look at the halakhah. And it is in the halakhah that you will find the essence of Judaism. And it was, I think, radical when he wrote it. It's a very difficult book to read because it's from its time. It's based on dialectic and German and French philosophy. But at the end, what he argues is that modern Jewish philosophy must be nurtured on the historical religious consciousness that has been projected onto fixed objectives. So the material actions of the sources of a halakhah. A new world waits this formulation. It was a challenge, I think, Rabbi, to look at halakhah differently, and it really was a talking point. Do you remember reading it, discussing it, coming in contact with it?
It was always difficult. When I was a yeshiva student, it was difficult, and now it's really difficult. What Rabbi Soloveitchik is really saying is that the kind of the building blocks of everything Jewish is the halakhah. If you want to understand, what makes a Jew tick, you need to look at the halakhah. Now, from Rabbi Soloveitchik's perspective, a very Lithuanian perspective, they were anti the Hasidim, and therefore they didn't focus kind of on connection to God in a kind of spiritual way. They thought that the answer to everything was in the formulation of the halakhah. You said it's a little dated. I mean, most people don't think that way anymore. I think, Geoffrey, that's a reflection historically about the fact that Hasidism, and especially Chabad, has really made a tremendous impact, so that nobody thinks just of halakha anymore. It's always halakha plus something else.
Fascinating, fascinating. I mean, I think the arguments he makes in this lengthy book is very dated, but the argument and the challenge that he puts to us, it's still a challenge. And I think last week in the first part of this series, when we talked about those 3 commandments, and for instance, we talked about shichacha, leaving the wheat when you pick up the harvest and when you pick up the grain, and we compared that to shichacha lifnei kisei hakavod, that on Yom Kippur, on Rosh Hashanah, we say that God doesn't forget anything, but we'd really like God to act like us when we're following God's commandments, and we have selective memory. I do think that that comes through in the halakhah itself. And so what I'm saying is he really did get me thinking, and I think there is something there that the halakhah is not only a language, but it is a language, according to Soloveitchik in any case, that projects, embeds the essence of our traditions. Now, the example that he gives, the first example that he gives, is kind of timely. And he kind of compares Maimonides of the Moreh Nevuchim, of the Guide for the Perplexed, who is busy giving historical anecdote, old reasons for things, and the Maimonides of Mishnah Torah. And he says, in Mishnah Torah, Maimonides says, even though sounding of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is a decree, it is a chok, still, he calls it a gezerat hakasuv. We know it only because it is commanded. He says it contains an illusion. It contains a remez. And what Soloveitchik learns is this: wake up, you sleepy ones, from the sleep you slumber. When we discuss this in the Shtiebel, I said it's kind of like a a baby's cry. That's a universal sound that no one can hear without perking up, listening, even feeling emotional that there's something in need. And I think what he was saying here is that without commentary and without embellishment, Maimonides is saying there is in this language of halakha something that tells you to wake up, something that tells you forget the truth of the vanities of the time and throughout the year and focus. And so I do think that Soloveitchik is onto something, and I think it's an approach that is worth listening to. And as I said before, I really do believe it's lishmoa lemitzvotav, to listen to the commandments. And I also quoted the fact that Heschel, I called it a hot mic moment. One of the students of Heschel, after Heschel passed away, said that when he heard Heschel once say, there never was, there never will be a halachic man. And there are authors that talk about Heschel as the Aggadic man, because we all know Heschel writes the Sabbath. The Heschel writes the earth is the Lord's. He talks about the people. He talks about the stories and the midrashim. And you really have this conflict between Aggadic man, the Aggada that we have, and the halakhah. And I said, and I'm saying today, if we're going to look at halakhah as a language, why don't we look at a poet? Why don't we look at a sofer, at a writer? And as long as we're on the subject, Rabbi, why don't we look at a rebellious son? So there was a rebellious son, and his name was Chaim Nachman Bialik. And he lost his father young in age. He was raised by his Orthodox grandfather. He was obviously a very smart, talented young man, and he went to the yeshiva in Volozhin. And he studied there, but while he was studying tractates of Talmud, he also was becoming a maskil and a child of the Enlightenment. And finally, the Enlightenment pulled him too strongly. And according to Wikipedia, it says, when he was kicked out of the yeshiva or agreed to leave, he was taken by Chaim Soloveitchik. That is the grandfather of Joseph Soloveitchik, who has Ish Halakha. And he was taken to the outskirt of the yeshiva. And as Rabbi Chaim was escorting him out, Bialik asked why. In response, the rabbi said he had spent the time convincing Bialik not to use his writing talents against the yeshiva world or Torah. So we are going to end today's podcast with reading directly from an amazing monograph that Bialik wrote called Halakha and Aggada, and it is in Sfaria. So I really tell you all to read it in its original from beginning to end. But this is what he writes, and he's talking about this argument between which is more important, the Aggada or the Halakha. On these opposite appellations which contrast Halakha and Aggada, I could add more infinitely, and it is obvious that each in there would be a bit of truth. But is there nothing to learn from this? The popular position that Halakha and the Aggada are two enemies, one thing and its reverse? Those who say this are confusing fundamental nature with outside appearance. To whom are they similar? To the one who decides that the river's ice and water are two distinct materials. He compares halakha to water in ice form or liquid form. They're two of the same. The halakha and the Aggada are not, in fact, anything except two halves of the same whole, two faces of the same creature. The connection between the two of them is like that from speech to thought and feeling, or from action and tangible form to speech. The halakha is the crystallization, the final and inevitable result of the Aggada. The Aggada is the core of the halakha. This is amazing, Rabbi, to hear from a quote-unquote secular Jew, a child, I would say a patriarch of the Enlightenment. And he goes on.
By the way, I didn't say this on Shabbos, but of course, he started in yeshiva and he became the patriarch of the Enlightenment. He's talking about himself. Without the yeshiva, he never could have done what he did.
I love it. He goes on. Halakha, however, is no less a work of art than Aggada. Its art is the greatest in the world, the art of life and the paths of life. Its material is the living person with all the impulses of his heart. Its methods are personal, communal, and national education, and its fruits are a continuum of days of proper deeds and lives, the paving of a way of life through the twists and turns of the individual and the group, a proper way for a person in the world and a refined path in life. The creations of halakha's hands are not like the creations of the hands of other arts, such as sculpture, drawing, architecture, song, and poetry, which are concentrated and unified in matter, space, and time. Rather, they join together little by little, point by point, from all of the flow of a man's life and deeds. In the end, give over the final product one form, whether complete or damaged. Halakha is the guiding art and the teaching art of an entire nation. Likewise, the Cathedral of Cologne, the Cathedral of Milan, and Notre Dame in Paris were perfect in their beauty, and because what they became by the efforts of the world-class artists for hundreds of years, each of whom in this gave his life and the best creative powers exclusively to this holy work. And here's where he gets into the absolutely boring, pedantic pages of the Talmud itself in a way that blew me away. He says, the children of Israel has its own magnificent creation, a lofty holy day, Queen Shabbat, Shabbat HaMalkah. In the imagination of the nation, it has developed into a living being with a body and the figure of a body, all radiance and beauty. Is she not a creature all of Aggada, of legend, of tale? Is she not herself a source of life and sanctity to an entire nation and a wellspring flowing with divine inspirations for poets and liturgists? And even so, who will say, who will ascertain by whose hand she was crafted, and who made her into what she is? By the hand of halakhah, law, or by the hand of Aggada, legend? Tractate Shabbat has 157 double pages, and Tractate Eruvin has 105, and they are almost entirely devoid of Aggada. They mostly comprise examinations and precise legal analyses into the 39 law labors and their subcategories and the fixing of domains with what does one light, with what does an animal go out, how does one communalize a domain, how exhausting to the spirit, exclamation mark. How much acuity wasted on every little serif. And when I transverse among those pages and see groups upon groups of sages and scholars at their work, I say, indeed, artists of life I see before me, exclamation point. Artists of life in the workshop and at the potter's wheel. Tremendous spiritual work like this at the same time like an ant and like a giant. Works for its own sake and born of love and faith without bounds is impossible without divine inspiration. Each of these individuals did their part according to their character and their soul's inclinations, and all of them together were beholden to an exalted will that ruled over them. This is nothing but a single lofty ideal, a single elevated image of Shabbat floating before the eyes of these exceptional people, and her spirit is what gathered them here from all the generations and made them into collaborators in her creation and enhancement. And what is the fruit of all these laborious works of halakha, of law? A day that is all Aggada, all legend. Shabbat Shalom.
Fantastic. And that is the life of Chaim Nachman Bialik. Thank you, Geoffrey. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. We look forward to seeing you all next week.
See you all next week. Shabbat Shalom.